This strange 1885 family photo reveals a clue experts can't explain. The rain drummed against the tall windows of the Charleston Heritage Museum as Dr. Rebecca Hamilton carefully lifted another cardboard box from the storage shelf. It was late afternoon on a gray November day in 2024, and she was 3 weeks into cataloging a collection donated by a local estate. Most items were predictable: Civil War letters, faded receipts, Victorian jewelry. But Rebecca approached each piece with the same meticulous attention that had defined her 15-year career as an archivist. She pulled out a leather portfolio, its edges cracked with age, and untied the brittle ribbon holding it closed. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, was a large photograph mounted on thick cardboard. Rebecca's breath caught. The image showed 6 people, a black family dressed in formal Victorian attire standing in front of a modest but well-built wooden house. The photograph was remarkably well preserved, the sepia tones still rich and clear. Rebecca carried it to her workstation and positioned it under the LED magnifying lamp. The family consisted of a man and woman, likely in their 30s, and 4 children ranging from perhaps 6 to 16 years old. They wore their finest clothes, the father in a dark suit with a watch chain visible across his vest, the mother in a high-collared dress with intricate lace detailing, the children in carefully pressed shirts and dresses. Their expressions were solemn, as was typical for photographs of that era when subjects had to remain perfectly still for long exposures. But something about the image unsettled her. Rebecca had examined thousands of 19th century photographs, and her trained eye could detect when something was deliberately composed versus accidentally captured. She leaned closer, studying each face, each detail of their clothing, the construction of the house behind them. Then she noticed their hands. The father's right hand rested on the shoulder of the oldest boy, but his left hand was positioned at his side with fingers arranged in an unusual configuration. 3 fingers extended, 2 bent inward, thumb pressed against his palm. The mother's hands were clasped in front of her, but not naturally. Her fingers were interlaced in a complex pattern, each digit precisely placed. The children, too, each had their hands positioned in ways that seemed deliberate, almost ceremonial. Rebecca's pulse quickened. She had seen deliberate hand positioning in photographs before, Masonic symbols, religious gestures, even early sign language. But this was different. The patterns were too specific, too coordinated across all 6 individuals. This wasn't random. This was intentional. She reached for her phone and photographed the image, then opened her laptop. Whatever this family was communicating through their hand positions, it had been important enough to preserve in what was likely an expensive photograph in 1885. Rebecca pulled up her research databases, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed. She had stumbled onto something extraordinary, though she didn't yet understand what. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and the museum's fluorescent lights hummed softly in the empty archive room. Rebecca spent the next 3 days consumed by the photograph. She created detailed sketches of each hand position, measured angles, counted fingers, and documented every visible detail. She cross-referenced the image with databases of Victorian photography, Masonic symbols, and period hand gestures. Nothing matched. The patterns were unique, or at least unknown to modern scholarship. On Thursday morning, she decided to consult Dr. James Rivera, a colleague who specialized in African American history in the post-Civil War South. She found him in his cluttered office on the museum's 3rd floor, surrounded by stacks of books and archival boxes. James looked up from his laptop as she entered, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "Rebecca, you look like you haven't slept," he said, concern crossing his face. "I haven't, much," she admitted, placing her laptop on his desk and opening the high-resolution scan of the photograph. "James, I need you to look at something. Tell me what you see." He leaned forward, studying the image carefully. His expression shifted from casual interest to intense focus. After a long moment, he sat back in his chair, removing his glasses. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. "In the estate collection. It came with a bunch of other items, nothing particularly remarkable. But look at their hands, James. Every single person is positioning them in a very specific way. It's deliberate." James stood and moved closer to the screen, zooming in on the father's hands, then the mother's, then each child's. His jaw tightened. "Rebecca, I've seen something like this before. Not exactly this, but similar. There were rumors, stories passed down in some African-American families, about secret hand signals used during slavery, ways to communicate without words, to identify safe houses, to warn of danger. Most historians dismissed them as folklore because there was never any physical evidence." Rebecca's heart raced. "But this is evidence?" "This might be evidence," James corrected carefully. "We need to be certain before we make any claims. But if this is what I think it is, you found something that could change how we understand communication networks among enslaved people and their descendants." He pulled a book from his shelf, flipping through pages until he found what he was looking for. It was a collection of oral histories from formerly enslaved people, compiled in the 1930s. One passage, highlighted in yellow, described finger talk, used on plantations to coordinate escape attempts. The descriptions are vague, James said, but they mention specific patterns. 3 fingers for north, 2 for danger, crossed thumbs for safe passage. Look at the father's left hand in your photo. Rebecca looked, 3 fingers extended. Her skin prickled with excitement and disbelief. We need to find out who this family was, she said. The back of the photograph's mounting board provided their first real lead. In faded pencil, someone had written, "The family, Charleston, 1885. No names, no street address, just those 4 words. But it was enough to begin. Rebecca and James spent the following week immersed in Charleston's historical records. They started with the 1880 and 1890 census data, searching for black families with 4 children living in Charleston during that period. The task was overwhelming. Hundreds of families fit that basic description. The city had a significant African American population in the post-Reconstruction era, many of them former slaves who had stayed in the region or migrated from nearby plantations. They narrowed their search by focusing on families with some economic means, since the photograph itself suggested prosperity. The clothing, the house, the ability to afford a professional photographer all indicated that this family had achieved a level of financial stability uncommon for black families in 1885 South Carolina, just 20 years after the end of slavery. Rebecca discovered property records that helped refine their search. She found deed transfers from the 1880s showing black families purchasing land in specific Charleston neighborhoods. One area, near the historic district but slightly removed from the wealthiest white sections, showed a cluster of such purchases between 1882 and 1887. Meanwhile, James contacted elderly members of Charleston's African American community, asking if anyone had family photographs or stories from that era. One woman, Mrs. Eleanor Washington, invited them to her home in the East Side neighborhood. She was 92 years old, sharp-minded, and keeper of her family's history. Her living room was filled with photographs spanning generations. She served them sweet tea and listened carefully as Rebecca explained what they had found. My grandmother told me stories, Mrs. Washington said slowly, her voice still strong despite her age. She was born in 1890, so she would have been a child when your photograph was taken. She talked about families who kept secrets, who knew things from before freedom. She said some people could talk with their hands, and only certain people understood. Rebecca leaned forward. Did she ever describe how it looked? The hand signals? She showed me once when I was very young. I didn't understand it then, and I'd forgotten most of it. Mrs. Washington paused, her gnarled hands resting in her lap. But I remember she said it was dangerous knowledge, that people died protecting it, and people were saved by knowing it. James asked gently, Did your grandmother ever mention specific families? Names of people who carried this knowledge? Mrs. Washington thought for a long moment. There was one name she mentioned several times, a man named Samuel. She said he was a teacher, but not the kind who worked in schools. She called him a keeper of the old ways. I don't know his last name. Grandma never said, or maybe I forgot. It wasn't much, but it was something. A name, a role, a connection to the photograph's mystery. As they drove back to the museum, Rebecca felt the weight of what they were uncovering. This wasn't just an interesting historical curiosity. This was a glimpse into a hidden world of resistance, survival, and solidarity. Rebecca's breakthrough came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after discovering the photograph. She was cross-referencing property deeds with church records from Charleston's black churches in the 1880s. One name appeared repeatedly, Samuel Freeman, listed as a community teacher and benefactor in the records of Mount Zion AME Church. She pulled up the property records again. In 1883, a Samuel Freeman had purchased a modest plot of land on Cumming Street, in the same neighborhood cluster she had identified earlier. The description of the house matched what was visible in the photograph, a single-story wooden structure with a distinctive triangular gable above the front door. Her hands shook as she entered the address into a historical map database. The property still existed, though the original house had been replaced decades ago with a small brick building that now housed a community center. She called James despite the hour. He answered on the 3rd ring, groggy but alert when he heard the urgency in her voice. I found him. Samuel Freeman. I think the man in the photograph is Samuel Freeman. By morning, they were back in the archives, pulling everything related to Samuel Freeman. What they found was remarkable. Freeman had been born enslaved on a rice plantation outside Charleston in 1847. After emancipation, he had worked as a dock laborer, saved his money, taught himself to read and write, and by his 30s had established himself as a literacy teacher for formerly enslaved adults. But the official records only told part of his story. In the church archives, they found something else. Letters between Freeman and other community leaders, written in careful, formal English, discussing educational initiatives and community welfare programs. The language was innocuous, but certain phrases repeated too often to be coincidental. extending the hand of fellowship, securing safe passage, teaching the old knowledge to the young. James spread the letters across the reading table. This is coded language. They're not just talking about literacy programs, they're talking about preserving and teaching the hand signals. Rebecca nodded. But why? The war was over, slavery was abolished. Why continue using secret signals? Because freedom on paper doesn't mean freedom in practice, James said quietly. This was 1885, Rebecca. Reconstruction was ending. Jim Crow was beginning. Black people were being lynched, their property stolen, their rights stripped away through legal manipulation and violence. If you needed to warn someone about danger, identify who could be trusted, coordinate community protection, you'd need a way to communicate that couldn't be intercepted or understood by hostile authorities. Rebecca looked again at the photograph, seeing it with new understanding. The Freeman family wasn't just posing for a portrait. They were documenting their knowledge, creating a permanent record of signals that might otherwise be lost. Each hand position was deliberate, each pattern meaningful. We need to decode what they're saying, Rebecca said. Every hand position in this photograph is telling us something specific. Samuel Freeman was a teacher. This photograph is a lesson. Rebecca and James assembled a small team of experts. Dr. Patricia Holmes, a linguist specializing in nonverbal communication, Marcus Thompson, a historian who had studied Underground Railroad documentation, and Jennifer Kim, a digital imaging specialist who could enhance and analyze every detail of the photograph. They converted one of the museum's conference rooms into a research hub, covering the walls with enlarged prints of the photograph and detailed diagrams of each hand position. Jennifer's enhancement work revealed subtleties invisible to the naked eye. The precise angle of each finger, slight variations in pressure where fingers touched, the specific positioning of thumbs. Patricia approached the analysis systematically. If this is a communication system, she explained, it would need internal logic, consistency. We should look for patterns across all 6 individuals. Are certain positions repeated? Do the children mirror the parents or show variations? They discovered that the father's hands used 5 distinct finger configurations, 1 on each hand. The mother's hands showed 4 different patterns. Each child displayed between 2 and 3 unique positions. In total, the photograph contained 18 separate hand signals. Marcus cross-referenced these patterns with documented Underground Railroad symbols, quilts, songs, architectural markers. Some researchers had theorized that hand signals existed alongside these other communication methods, but evidence had always been circumstantial. Look at this, Marcus said, pointing to the father's left hand. 3 extended fingers pointing slightly upward. In the oral histories, James found 3 fingers represented north, or freedom. In his right hand on the boy's shoulder, the thumb is pressed between the index and middle finger. That's a protective gesture in several documented African communication systems. Patricia added, the mother's interlaced fingers. This isn't a casual clasp. Count the visible finger segments. 7 on the left side, 5 on the right. Those could be numerical codes, coordinates, dates, addresses. Jennifer projected an overlay onto the photograph, highlighting each hand position with a different color. The visual pattern that emerged was stunning. The signals formed a kind of visual language, each family member contributing specific pieces of information. They're not just preserving the signals, Rebecca said, her voice filled with awe. They're transmitting a specific message. This photograph is a map, an instruction manual, and a historical document all at once. Over the next 2 weeks, the team painstakingly decoded each element. The father's signals indicated directions and safe locations. The mother's hands contained what appeared to be numerical information, possibly dates or addresses using a base 5 counting system. The children's positions were simpler but equally important. Warnings, identifications of trustworthy individuals, and markers of community connection. But one element remained maddeningly unclear. The youngest child, a girl of perhaps 6 or 7, held her hands in a position none of them could interpret. Her right hand was raised to chest level, fingers curved in a specific shape, while her left hand was hidden behind her back. This is the key, Rebecca said, staring at the child's image. I can feel it. Everything else makes sense within the system we've identified, but this position doesn't fit any pattern we've found. James leaned back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. Maybe it's not a standard signal. Maybe it's personal, specific to the Freeman family or this particular message. Rebecca picked up her phone. Mrs. Washington, we need to talk to her again. Mrs. Washington welcomed them back into her home on a cold Saturday morning. Rebecca had brought high-resolution prints of the photograph, particularly focused on the youngest child's hand positions. The elderly woman put on her reading glasses and studied the images carefully. This child, Rebecca said gently, pointing to the little girl, her hand position doesn't match anything else in the photograph. Do you think your grandmother might have mentioned anything about children's signals or family-specific gestures? Mrs. Washington was quiet for a long time, her fingers tracing the outline of the child's raised hand. When she finally spoke, her voice was distant, as if reaching back through decades of memory. My grandmother had a saying. She used it when she wanted to tell me something important, something she didn't want others to understand. She'd say, "The smallest hands carry the biggest truths." Mrs. Washington looked up at them. She told me that during slavery, children were often used as messengers because white people didn't pay attention to them. They'd assume children were just playing, making random gestures, but the children were carrying messages between adults who couldn't risk being seen together. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken, so the child's signal might be the most important part of the message. Or the most dangerous, James added quietly. Mrs. Washington stood slowly and walked to a bookshelf in the corner of her room. She pulled out a worn Bible, its leather cover cracked and faded. This belonged to my grandmother. She marked certain pages, wrote notes in the margins. I never understood most of it, but maybe you will. She opened the Bible to a page near the back, in the book of Revelation. In the margin, drawn in careful pencil, was a small sketch, a hand with fingers curved in a specific position. It looked remarkably similar to the youngest Freeman child's raised hand. Rebecca's breath caught. "What does the text say?" "On this page," James read aloud, "and I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he cried with a loud voice to the four angels, to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, Hurt not the earth, neither the sea nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads." Mrs. Washington nodded slowly. My grandmother said her people used Bible verses as codes. The book, chapter, and verse numbers could mean addresses or dates, and the content of the verse would tell you what kind of place it was: safe, dangerous, a hiding spot, a meeting place. Patricia, who had accompanied them, quickly pulled up a digital concordance on her tablet. Revelation, chapter 7. If we treat the chapter as a street number and the verse as a building number. Marcus was already pulling up historical Charleston maps on his phone. Chapter 7, verse 3. In 1885, that could correspond to... He zoomed in on a section of the map. There, 7 Chalmers Street. It existed in the 1880s, in the heart of the black commercial district. Rebecca felt the pieces clicking into place. The child's hand signal isn't just a message. It's a location marker. She's pointing the way to something hidden at that address. "But what?" James asked. "The building's long gone. The street's been redeveloped multiple times." Mrs. Washington closed the Bible carefully. "Before my grandmother died, she told me one more thing. She said Samuel Freeman's family had buried something important, something that couldn't be found until the right time came. She said, when the children of freedom are ready to remember, the smallest hands will show them where to look." Rebecca stared at the photograph, at the little girl's careful gesture, and felt the weight of 140 years of hidden history pressing down on her. Whatever Samuel Freeman had buried at 7 Chalmers Street was meant to be found, but only by those who understood the language of the photograph. "We need to find out what's at that location now," she said, "and we need to figure out how to look beneath it." The modern address of 7 Chalmers Street was now part of a small public park, a half-acre green space with benches, a playground, and old oak trees that had witnessed more than a century of Charleston's transformation. The park had been established in the 1960s, after a fire destroyed the original buildings that had stood there. Rebecca and James obtained permission from the city's Historical Preservation Office to conduct a ground-penetrating radar survey of the site. They explained it as routine archaeological assessment, which was true, if incomplete. They didn't mention the photograph or the hand signals, not yet. Some discoveries needed to be confirmed before they could be shared. On a crisp December morning, a team of archaeologists arrived with their equipment. Dr. Raymond Pierce, who led the university's archaeology department, had agreed to supervise the survey personally. He was a careful, methodical man in his 50s who treated historical sites with the reverence they deserved. "What exactly are we looking for?" Raymond asked as his team set up the GPR equipment. "We're not entirely sure," Rebecca admitted. "Historical records suggest that this location was significant to the African American community in the 1880s, but we don't know why. We're hoping the radar will show us if there are any structural remnants or anomalies beneath the surface." The GPR cart moved slowly across the park, sending electromagnetic waves into the ground and recording the reflections. On a monitor, the subsurface features appeared as variations in signal strength. Areas of disturbed soil, buried objects, or architectural remains showed as distinct patterns. For the first 2 hours, they found exactly what they expected: the foundations of the 19th century buildings, some buried utilities, and the typical archaeological debris of an urban site. But then, in the northeastern corner of the park, beneath a particularly large oak tree, the radar detected something different. "That's unusual," Raymond said, studying the monitor. "There's a void space about 6 feet down, rectangular, roughly 4 feet by 3 feet. And it's lined with something, brick, maybe, or stone. Whatever it is, it's man-made and deliberately constructed." James looked at Rebecca. "A vault. Or a hiding place," she said quietly. Raymond frowned. The city will need to approve any excavation. This could take weeks, maybe months. But Rebecca had already thought of that. What if it's not archaeological? What if it's a public safety issue? Old underground structures can collapse, especially in this climate. Sinkholes, subsidence? The city takes those concerns seriously. Raymond understood immediately. I'll file a report recommending immediate investigation of a potential structural hazard. That should expedite approval. 3 days later, the excavation began. They erected a small tent over the site to provide privacy and protection from the elements. A careful team of archaeologists removed soil layer by layer, documenting everything as they went deeper. At 5 feet down, they hit brick, a small vaulted chamber beautifully constructed with mortared brick walls and a sealed stone cap. The craftsmanship was exceptional, far beyond what would be expected for a simple storage cellar. This was built by someone who knew what they were doing, Raymond said, examining the brickwork, and built to last. The mortar is still intact after nearly 140 years. They cleared the soil from the stone cap, revealing a surface that was smooth and carefully dressed. And there, carved into the stone in neat letters, was an inscription. For those who remember the old ways. SF, 1885. Samuel Freeman. Rebecca's hands trembled as she photographed the inscription. They had found it. After months of research, after decoding the photograph, after following the trail of hand signals and historical fragments, they had found Samuel Freeman's hidden vault. "Let's open it," James said, his voice thick with emotion. Raymond nodded to his team. Using careful, deliberate movements, they pried up the stone cap, the ancient mortar cracking after more than a century. The cap was heavy, requiring 4 people to lift it. As they set it aside, Rebecca shone her flashlight into the darkness below. Inside was a metal box, still intact, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from moisture. Beside the box were several smaller packages, also wrapped in protective material. The preservation was remarkable. Samuel Freeman had understood that whatever he was hiding needed to survive far into the future. They lifted the metal box out carefully, treating it with the reverence it deserved. In the shelter of the tent, under controlled conditions, Rebecca and James opened it. Inside were documents, dozens of them, letters, maps, drawings, and what appeared to be a comprehensive manual, all written in careful handwriting, all dealing with the same subject, the secret communication system used by enslaved people and their descendants. But there was more, much more. And what they found would rewrite the history of resistance, survival, and hope in the American South. The documents were transferred to the museum's climate-controlled conservation lab, where Rebecca and a team of specialists spent the next week carefully unfolding, photographing, and transcribing each page. What emerged was staggering in its scope and significance. Samuel Freeman had created what could only be described as an encyclopedia of resistance. The main document, bound in leather and spanning nearly 200 pages, was titled A Manual of Silent Speech for the Preservation of Freedom and the Protection of Our People. The manual was divided into sections. The first contained detailed illustrations of hand signals, hundreds of them, far more than Rebecca and her team had initially imagined. Each signal was drawn precisely, with notes on its meaning, context of use, and regional variations. Freeman had documented signals for directions, warnings, identifications, numbers, locations, and even complex concepts like trusted friend, informant, safe until dawn, and children hidden here. "This is extraordinary," Patricia said, carefully turning the pages with gloved hands. "This isn't just a communication system. It's a complete language. It has grammar, syntax, even dialectical variations. Freeman documented signals from Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and Alabama. He was collecting and standardizing information from across the entire South." The second section contained maps, hand-drawn but remarkably accurate maps of Charleston and surrounding areas, with locations marked using the hand signal code. Safe houses, meeting places, hiding spots, routes out of the city, places where sympathetic white allies could be found, all meticulously documented. James studied one map intensely. These locations, some of them are well-known Underground Railroad sites, but others aren't in any historical record I've seen. If we could verify these, we'd be filling enormous gaps in our understanding of how the Freedom Network actually functioned. The third section was perhaps the most moving. It contained personal testimonies, stories written by formerly enslaved people describing how the hand signals had saved their lives, reunited families, or enabled escapes. Freeman had collected these stories, he explained in an introduction, so that future generations might understand the courage and ingenuity of those who fought for freedom with nothing but their hands and their will. One testimony, written by a woman named Hannah, described how she had used hand signals to communicate with her children who had been sold to a different plantation 12 miles away. For 3 years, she had managed to see them twice a year at regional market days, and through the signals, they had coordinated information, shared news of family members, and maintained their bond despite forced separation. Another testimony, from a man named Isaiah, described how he had escaped from a plantation in 1863 and made his way north using only hand signals to identify safe houses. I could not read the written word, he wrote, but I could read the language of hands, and it spoke to me as clearly as Scripture, guiding me from darkness into light. But it was the fourth section that took Rebecca's breath away. It was titled, "The Network of Watchers, a record of those who carry the knowledge forward." This section contained names, hundreds of names, organized by city and region. Beside each name was a brief description. Keeper of the Eastern Signals, teacher of the old ways, safe house provider, document carrier. Freeman had documented an entire covert network of individuals who had committed to preserving and teaching the hand signal system. "This isn't just historical documentation," Rebecca said, her voice trembling. "This is evidence of organized resistance continuing 2 decades after the war ended. Freeman wasn't working alone. He was part of a structured, sophisticated network of people who understood that the fight for true freedom wasn't over." Marcus pointed to one entry. "Look at the dates. Some of these people were still active in the 1890s, early 1900s. This network might have continued well into the 20th century." But the most important discovery was in the final pages of the manual. Freeman had included a message addressed specifically to whoever found the documents. To the finder of these words, "If you read this, then enough time has passed that these truths can be told safely. I write this in the year 1885, 20 years after slavery's end, but in a time when freedom remains fragile and incomplete. We who remember the old ways preserve them not from nostalgia, but from necessity. The hand signals that guided our people to freedom in the darkest days must be remembered, so that future generations understand the depth of our struggle and the ingenuity of our survival. I have buried these documents with the hope that they will be found when our descendants are truly free. Free to know their history without fear, free to honor those who came before, free to understand that resistance takes many forms, and that even the smallest gesture can carry the weight of liberation. If you have found this, you have learned to read the language my family speaks in the photograph that lies with these papers. You understand that we do not merely pose for a picture. We teach, we remember, and we pass forward the tools of survival. Tell our story, not as one of suffering alone, but as one of brilliant, creative resistance. Tell how we spoke in silence, how we organized in secret, how we saved each other with nothing but our hands and our unbreakable will. Tell how we were never helpless, never passive, but always fighting, in ways large and small, for the freedom we were denied. This is our legacy. Guard it well and share it when the time is right." Samuel Freeman, December 1885. Rebecca set down the document, tears streaming down her face. The photograph, which had seemed like a simple family portrait, was revealed as something far more profound, a deliberate act of historical preservation, a teaching tool, and a message sent across 140 years to the descendants of those who had lived through America's darkest chapter. The team knew they couldn't keep this discovery to themselves, but they also understood the responsibility that came with it. These weren't just historical artifacts, they were sacred knowledge, passed down through generations of suffering and survival. Before going public, they needed to consult with the descendants of the families mentioned in Freeman's documents. James took the lead in this effort. Using genealogical databases and working with local African American historical societies, he began tracing the descendants of the names listed in Freeman's network. It was painstaking work, following family lines forward, through census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and death records. Over the next 2 months, they identified and contacted 73 living descendants of people named in Freeman's documents. The responses varied. Some families had vague oral histories that suddenly made sense. Others had no idea their ancestors had been part of this network, and a few had been specifically waiting, across generations, for this knowledge to resurface. One of those families was the descendants of Samuel Freeman himself. His great-great-granddaughter, Maya Freeman, lived in Atlanta and worked as a civil rights attorney. When James called to explain what they had found, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I need to come there," she finally said. "My grandmother told me stories. She said someday someone would find Grandpa Samuel's treasure. I thought it was just a family legend." Maya arrived in Charleston 3 days later. She was in her 60s, tall and dignified, with her ancestors' same penetrating gaze visible in the old photograph. Rebecca and James met her at the museum after hours, giving her privacy to see the documents for the first time. Maya stood before the photograph of her ancestors, tears running down her face. "I've seen copies of this picture my whole life," she said softly. "It hung in my grandmother's house, then my mother's house, then mine, but no one alive could tell me what it meant. Grandma would say, 'They're talking with their hands,' but she didn't know what they were saying. The knowledge got lost sometime in the early 1900s. Rebecca showed her the manual, the maps, the testimonies. Maya read her great-great-grandfather's final message, her hands shaking as she turned the pages. "He wanted us to remember," she whispered, "not just what was done to us, but what we did for ourselves, how we resisted, how we protected each other, how we survived." Other descendants had similar reactions. Mrs. Washington's family discovered that her grandmother had indeed been taught some of the hand signals as a child and had been trying, in her own way, to preserve that knowledge through her cryptic Bible notes and careful stories. A man named Thomas Jefferson, no relation to the president, learned that his great-great-grandfather had been one of Freeman's document carriers, responsible for transporting encoded messages between Charleston and Columbia using the hand signal system. Thomas was a professor of African American studies at a university in North Carolina, and he wept as he read his ancestors' testimony about narrowly avoiding a lynch mob by using hand signals to identify a sympathetic white shopkeeper who hid him. The families gathered in Charleston in late February 2025 for a private viewing of the complete archive. More than 40 people crowded into the museum's community room, representing multiple generations. The youngest was a 6-year-old girl, the oldest a 97-year-old man whose grandfather had known Samuel Freeman personally. Rebecca and James presented their findings, explaining how the photograph had led them to the buried vault, how they had decoded the hand signals, and what the documents revealed about the sophisticated resistance network that had operated across the South. When they finished, Maya stood to speak. "Our ancestors were brilliant," she said, her voice strong and clear. "They took the most basic human tool, their hands, and turned it into a weapon of liberation. They created a communication system so subtle, so hidden in plain sight, that it went undetected for generations. And Samuel Freeman had the foresight to preserve it, to send it forward to us, so we would know." She turned to look at the photograph of her family. "He's still teaching us, even now, still showing us that resistance is creative, that survival is an art, and that our people never stopped fighting for freedom, even when the world tried to break them." The room was silent except for quiet weeping. These were tears of grief for what had been suffered, but also tears of pride for what had been achieved, and tears of gratitude that the story had finally been recovered and could now be told. An elderly woman named Dorothy raised her hand. "What happens now? What do we do with this knowledge?" Rebecca looked at James, then at the assembled descendants. "That's not our decision to make," she said. "These are your ancestors, your history, your legacy. We're here to help preserve and document it, but you should decide how it's shared with the world." The families talked late into the night, debating, discussing, sometimes disagreeing, but ultimately coming to a consensus. They would share the discovery publicly, but they would do so on their terms, with their voices leading the narrative. They would ensure that Samuel Freeman's story wasn't just about what had been done to enslaved people, but what enslaved people had done for themselves. On March 15, 2025, the Charleston Heritage Museum held a press conference that made international headlines. The room was packed with journalists, historians, educators, and members of the African American community. Television cameras lined the back wall, and the event was live-streamed to audiences around the world. Maya Freeman stood at the podium, flanked by Rebecca, James, and a dozen other descendants of the families named in Samuel Freeman's documents. Behind them, projected on a large screen, was the 1885 photograph, the image that had started everything. "My name is Maya Freeman," she began, "and I stand before you as the great-great-granddaughter of Samuel Freeman, a man who was born into slavery in 1847 and died a free man in 1912. Today, we share with you a discovery that changes how we understand American history, the lived experience of enslaved and formerly enslaved people, and the sophisticated methods of resistance that helped our ancestors survive and fight for freedom." She explained the photograph, the hand signals, the buried vault, and the documents that had been preserved for 140 years. As she spoke, images appeared on the screen. Pages from Freeman's manual, maps marked with safe houses, testimonies written in careful handwriting by people who had lived through slavery and its aftermath. "For too long," Maya said. "The story of enslaved people has been told as one of passive suffering. We've been taught that our ancestors simply endured, that they waited for others to free them. But this discovery proves what many of us have always known in our hearts. Our people never stopped fighting. They fought in ways loud and quiet, visible and invisible. They created languages that couldn't be suppressed, networks that couldn't be destroyed, and methods of communication that operated right under the noses of those who tried to control them." Rebecca then presented the academic findings, the linguistic analysis of the hand signal system, the archaeological evidence from the vault, the historical documentation of the network that Freeman had recorded. She explained how this discovery filled gaps in the historical record and provided concrete evidence for practices that had previously existed only in oral tradition. "This isn't just a feel-good story about finding old documents," Rebecca said firmly. "This is evidence of organized resistance, of community protection networks, of deliberate historical preservation by people who understood that their experiences needed to be recorded. Samuel Freeman was a historian, an educator, and an activist who used the tools available to him to ensure that this knowledge wouldn't be lost." The press conference lasted 2 hours, with questions from journalists, comments from other descendants, and presentations from the various experts who had worked on the project. The tone was celebratory, but also serious. This was history that needed to be understood in its full complexity, neither romanticized nor oversimplified. In the weeks that followed, the story spread globally. Major news outlets ran features on the discovery. Academic journals published papers analyzing different aspects of the hand signal system. Museums around the country requested loans of materials for exhibitions. Documentary filmmakers arrived in Charleston to tell the story. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from ordinary people, especially Black Americans, who saw in Samuel Freeman's story a reflection of their own family histories, their own ancestors' struggles and triumphs. Schools began teaching about the hand signals as part of African American history curricula. Community groups organized workshops to learn the signals, preserving them for future generations. The photograph itself, which had been stored in a box for decades, was now properly conserved and displayed in the Charleston Heritage Museum's main gallery. Visitors stood before it daily, studying the hand positions, reading the accompanying explanations, and connecting with a family that had lived 140 years ago but whose message still resonated. Rebecca often stood in the gallery watching visitors engage with the photograph. She thought about Samuel Freeman sitting for this picture in 1885, carefully positioning each family member's hands, encoding a message that he hoped someone, someday, would understand. He had trusted that the future would be ready to receive his gift. One afternoon, a young black girl, perhaps 8 years old, stood before the photograph with her mother. The child studied the hands carefully, then tried to replicate the youngest Freeman child's signal. "Why did they do this, Mama?" the girl asked. Her mother knelt beside her. "Because they were strong and smart, baby. Because they found ways to protect each other when the world was cruel, and because they wanted us to remember that our people were never helpless. We were always fighting, always surviving, always finding ways to be free." The girl nodded solemnly, her small hand still held in the signal position. In that moment, Rebecca understood that Samuel Freeman's mission had succeeded. The knowledge had been preserved, the story had been told, and a new generation was learning about the brilliant, creative resistance of their ancestors. That evening, as Rebecca locked up the museum, she paused one last time before the photograph. Samuel Freeman looked out at her with his steady gaze, his hands positioned in their coded message. After 140 years of silence, he was finally being heard. "Thank you," she whispered to the image. "Thank you for trusting us with this. Thank you for showing us how to remember." The photograph offered no reply, but none was needed. The hands spoke volumes, across time, across generations, across the vast distance between 1885 and 2025. They spoke of survival, resistance, love, and an unbreakable determination to be free. And now, at last, the world was listening.